and understanding the root causes of the most serious crisis that will ever impact our species. We need these people. We need to trust them because they are telling us the truth.
Got that double. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the neurodivergence work you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
I'm ADHD, my daughter's autistic. My son's ADHD, so thank you very much.
Okay. I know some people are still taking their seats, but we have a packed and important agenda today, so we'll get started. I'm Mike Berners-Lee, and I'm chairing today's proceedings. And to get the ball rolling, it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce a tireless and very well-known campaigner and presenter on environmental issues. We're going to hear a few words just now from Chris Packham. Over to you, Chris.
What a remarkable volume we're standing in, architecturally. What a remarkable space. Let's imagine for a moment that it is space. For those of you at the back, that looks like a pale blue dot. But that's us. That's our home. That's our one and only home. It's the only one we've got. It's where all of our species has lived and died. Everyone. Every single human. It's where we breathe. It's where we eat, we laugh, we cry, we love, we hate. And as far as we know, together with all the other wonderful life on Earth, we are the only known life forms in the universe, and we've got nowhere else to go. This beautiful little blue planet is where we will either learn to live in harmony with the environment, or we will destroy ourselves and much of other life too. We're a remarkable species. We're adaptable, we're imaginative, we're innovative, we're resourceful, but most of all, we are organisms with a conscience. So do we, that's you and I, want it on our conscience, that's we, that's you and I, I'm talking about us in this room, do we want it on our conscience that we waste everything? Obviously not. So why is progress so slow? Why are we unbelievably even pulling back from rapidly and forthrightly addressing the greatest crises to ever threaten our species, climate breakdown and biodiversity loss? Well, to start with, climate denialism has been a mainstream thing again, thanks to the well-oiled machines of the rich, powerful and influential lobbyists from the fossil fuel and other industries. A dangerous wave of misinformation and lies fills our lives, but worse, it fills the lives of our decision makers. And these are the people who shape policy. Where's the evidence of this? Well, they just trashed COP30, an instrument that's always been doomed to fail because to reach any meaningful agreement requires a consensus, and the petro-states have always said no. So whatever you hear from those who might need to justify their presence there, let's be clear, the urgent mandates we desperately needed are missing in no action. The headline covering COP30 should read, "Fully paid up people peddling distraction and insane lies keep bad business as usual." And whilst we're on paid up, Fossil fuel companies are significant contributors to some of the UK's political parties. Why? What do they want? More importantly, what do they get? Presumably, at the very least, the opportunity to spin the lie of climate denialism to the public via some less scrupulous politicians. But look, I'll be kind. You know, keeping the status quo is natural, it's easy on the mind. But at this point, we all need to rise above those comfortable short-term options. This is where you, our leaders, need to win your Victoria Crosses. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hold on a moment, we are not stupid. We can balance the bullshit against the facts, the truth, the tried and tested data collected and analysed by the brilliant minds that deliver the brilliant cutting-edge science. But can we strike that balance? Well, I would argue that I can, because climate and biodiversity science are my daily bread and vegan butter. But what about you? And what about everyone out there? Are they getting access to the facts, access to the truth about the reality of what's happening to our one and only home? Well, you won't believe it, but this is the first briefing of its kind. And elsewhere, our wider media is either far from independent, outwardly biased, or simply failing in its duty to explain to everyone the gravity of our predicament. We must be able to know what is really going on, and none more so than many of you, those that we have elected to represent us, to guide us, to protect our future. You must listen to the science. You must listen to the science. Because if you don't, then things go wrong and lives are lost. The COVID inquiry was published recently, and it was a devastating indictment of poor governance. The headlines, you would have seen them: chaotic and toxic culture in Downing Street, too little too late, the cabinet was sidelined, Parliament didn't have enough of a role. Okay, but what really underpinned the failure? It's tragically simple. The report states that the threat of the virus was not taken seriously enough. That the first lockdown had come a week earlier, it would have saved an estimated 23,000 lives in England. So why wasn't it taken seriously enough? Two more quotes from the report reveal all. Against scientific advice, that first lockdown was lifted too early. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme was devised without scientific advice. Without scientific advice. People died. Lots of people died. Wildlife dies too. Next month, my colleagues and I at Wild Justice are taking a case to the High Court because against their own scientific advice, the government have chosen to persist with the culling of badgers. Because, and I'll paraphrase this, but I'll do so accurately, they didn't want to upset the farmers. As that sinks in, I'll tell you that in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, in one of the most nature-depleted set of nations on the planet, 240,000 badgers have been killed because the science has been sidelined. The failure to suppress the egos of government, their government departments and individuals, has cost lives. You see, it's not about you. It's not about your department. It's not about your parties. It's about us, those that have elected you. Because it's more than that. We didn't just elect you. We've given you our trust. And our lives and those of millions more are in your hands. Because what concerns us today is, sadly, tragically, far, far greater than COVID and the badger cull. It's not thousands, it's not hundreds of thousands or millions of lives that are at risk. It's billions of lives that are at risk. So to conclude, we must set aside all of our divisions. Everything that you might think that that person sitting at your shoulder has that's incompatible with you, that makes them different than you, you've got to set that aside. We are one species on one planet with one big problem and one last chance to sort it out. We have declared war on our one and only home. We've set our house on fire. So we, that's you and I, that's all of us, need to lead the UK on an immediate route to recovery. Now, some of you, I know you're thinking, hold on a moment, it's just the UK. We can't do it all on our own. We might be a small country, but we are a great country. And I can see some great people out here, a lot of good people. But the world will be lost by a lot of good people doing nothing. So we need action. Hope comes from action. Hope comes from courage. So please, listen and learn from the scientists and experts who are about to tell you the facts. The facts. I beseech you to hear their truth, the truth that they are going to tell you. I'm not proud. I'm scared. So I'm begging you to heed their warnings and give us hope. Because at the moment, there's not much of that left in the box. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So, as we've just heard, the information that we're going to be looking at is extremely serious, urgent, and it affects us all here in the UK. That is why we're calling this a national emergency briefing. Today is about facing an escalating polycrisis instead of pretending that it isn't happening. And we're not doing that to be depressing. Quite the opposite. In the words of James Baldwin, human rights campaigner, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And we need that change now. Sometimes I've wondered why I keep going pushing on this agenda, and sometimes I've despaired at where things are heading. And there's some difficult news in here, and we're going to face it together, and we're in it for the long haul. The situation is not yet hopeless, but we do have our backs right up against the wall. As we've just heard, it's not surprising that the climate is coming to bite us after 30 COPs have failed to even reduce the rate at which we're putting fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere. It's still going up year on year. It hasn't even begun to come down. And now, after COP30, attended by 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists, the words fossil fuel have been taken out of the final text. Our response couldn't be more inadequate. There's everything to play for, but we have to wake up. So this event is about resetting the national conversation, especially in the face of growing misinformation. And you've been invited here because you carry influence, whether that be in politics, in media, in business, whether you're a community leader or a faith leader or in some other capacity. Between us all, together, along with the follow-up events after this briefing, we have what it takes to create the societal tipping point that we so badly need to unlock full-scale action for the first time. In fact, you have already shown courage and leadership just being here today. Thanks especially to the many, many MPs who've come here today and chosen to prioritise this. Okay, so today we're going to look at what's going on, at what needs to happen, and what we can do from right now together to get things properly moving. In a moment, we're going to hear concise evidence about different aspects of the challenge we face. We're going to hear up-to-date evidence from some of the UK's and even some of the world's top experts on these subjects. And we're going to join it all up together, because the challenges, and if we're smart, the opportunities that we face are systemic. So it doesn't work to put them in silos. Everything that we will hear today is connected to everything else. By the way, you don't need to worry about taking notes. There'll be transcripts, there'll be notes, there'll be videos, and in due course there'll be a film to reference after this event. So just concentrate on taking it all in. After the presentations, there'll be a short time for questions, and if you want to submit one, you can do so using the QR code on your seat. And after that, for those who can stay, there'll be a great opportunity to network. The flow, just broadly, is we're going to start with where we are now. We're going to hear on the nature crisis, the climate crisis, extreme weather, and then tipping points. And then we'll move on to the societal impacts that are not fully appreciated here in the UK on our food system, on our health, and on our national security. And then we'll look at the implications, the threats and opportunities for the economy, and we'll look at what the energy transition looks like. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Professor Natalie Seddon, who's going to tell us about the nature crisis.
My message today is simple. Nature is not a nice to have. It's not a luxury. It is critical national infrastructure. When we destroy and degrade it, we expose this country to escalating risks: floods, fires, heat waves, food insecurity, and economic instability. When we protect and restore it, we can build resilience, create jobs, and strengthen the foundations of a safe, happy, and prosperous community and country. We are facing a national emergency, not only because the climate is changing, but because the living systems that regulate that climate, protect our homes and feed our people, are breaking down here in one of the most nature-depleted nations on Earth. So the facts are sobering. The UK ranks in the bottom 10% of countries globally on the Biodiversity Intactness Index, with only about half of its biodiversity remaining. Across the UK, monitored wildlife populations have declined by around 19% since the 1970s, and 1 in 6 of our species is now at risk of extinction. Now, that's not just a loss of beauty or heritage, critically important though that is. It's also a loss of function, the pollination of crops, the filtering of water, the regulation of floods and disease. Only 14% of rivers in England are in good ecological health under our own water framework regulations. Chemical pollution, sewerage discharge, soil erosion, agricultural runoff are choking the arteries of our landscapes. When rivers die, when rivers fail, so does our resilience to droughts, floods, and water scarcity for agriculture and industry. Our peatlands, which store phenomenal amounts of carbon, are mostly degraded. Instead of locking away carbon for millennia, they are emitting millions of tons of CO2 into our atmosphere a year and increasing wildfire risk. Meanwhile, only 7% of our woodlands are healthy, 3% of our lands and 8% of our waters are considered effectively protected for nature. The Office for Environmental Protection warns that the government is largely off track on almost every target set under the Environment Act. And the Office for National Statistics shows that many of the services nature supports are under growing pressure, even as we become more aware of their enormous economic value. So let me unpack why this should matter so much to those concerned with the nation's security, stability, and prosperity. First, flooding. Over 5 million properties in England are at risk of flooding from rivers, surface water, or the sea. And without stronger action, that number is projected to rise significantly over the coming decades. Each major flood damages homes, infrastructure, transport, and energy and water systems. Yet some of the most effective defences are restored wetlands, peatlands, floodplains, and salt marsh, landscapes that slow and store water and deliver very high benefit-to-cost ratios. The second is food security. Productive farming depends on healthy soils and thriving pollinators. Soil degradation already costs England and Wales around £1 billion a year. Meanwhile, pollinators contribute over £500 million annually to UK agriculture, and yet pesticides and habitat loss continue to push them into steep decline. A nature-poor countryside is so much less productive and so much less resilient. Third, health and productivity. We know now, and there's enormous amounts of evidence supporting this, that access to nature reduces anxiety, depression, and cardiovascular disease. NHS pilots in green social prescribing are beginning to show lower GP visits and reduced use of medication. In towns and cities, the loss or lack of trees and green space has made us dangerously exposed to extreme heat. So in 2022, nearly 3,000 people in England died from heat-related causes. It's more from road traffic accidents. And this figure will rise as summers warm. Conversely, urban forests and parks cut heat mortality, lower air pollution, and support learning and productivity. Fourth, economic and financial stability. Recent analyses by the Green Finance Institute and others suggest that if we continue to degrade nature, nature-related risks could severely cut UK GDP in the coming decade, delivering a macroeconomic shock on the scale of major financial crises. UK banks and insurers are materially exposed to nature-dependent sectors, and yet they continue to finance activities that degrade ecosystems. We are quite literally subsidising systemic risk. So this is not an issue on the margins of policy. This is a national security issue. Without a living, healthy biosphere, there is no stable economy, no food, no water security, and no public health resilience. At the moment, we have an economic system that is unravelling the web of life it depends on by subsidising pollution, rewarding short-term extraction, and discounting the future. So the central task for the next decade is to reform the rules and incentives of the economy so that they reward stewardship and regeneration rather than extraction, degradation, and constant delay. Now, as we get our own house in order, we also gain the credibility to call for the same ambition elsewhere. And that must include protecting and restoring regions such as the Amazon, the Congo Basin, New Guinea, which hold so much of the world's biological and cultural diversity and are critical for global climate and economic stability. What happens there directly affects our wealth and well-being here. Now, coming straight from COP30 in Brazil, I can tell you that this understanding, despite the headlines, this understanding is finally beginning to take root. too slowly, but it's taking root. But leadership abroad must be matched by commitment at home. And the thing is, the public, the UK public, is already calling for it. My own experiences with citizens' assemblies, including as science lead for the UK's first People's Assembly for Nature, show that people in this country care deeply about the living world, and they are angry at its dire state, and they want action. WWF's polling finds that more than half of Britons think that the government is not doing enough to protect and restore nature, and almost half of those who expressed an opinion want more support to reduce their environmental impact. You know, these are your voters calling for stronger action. Luckily, we know what works, and the science points to the following. First of all, we need to consider nature as critical infrastructure. Nature must quite literally sit alongside transport, energy and digital systems in national resilience planning. Treasury guidance already allows this. We just need to use it consistently, properly valuing the avoided costs of floods, heat deaths, water treatments and soil erosion, not only the price of building things. When we treat nature as essential infrastructure and when we treat it as kin, we finally plan for a world we are actually living in. Second, we need to stop funding harm and we need to reward restoration. Right now, billions in public and private finance readily flows into activities that degrade soils, pollute rivers, and destroy habitats. We have to end these subsidies, strengthen enforcement, and apply a simple universal test to spending and investment. Does this harm the biosphere, or can it help it? At the same time, we have to reward protection and restoration. Environmental land management schemes offer a very promising framework. I've spoken to many farmers who really want to embrace it, but they need stability, simplicity, scale, multi-year budgets so that they can plan and they can invest. We know that restoring hedgerows, wetlands and peatlands cuts flood peaks, improves water quality, stores carbon and can create skilled rural jobs. The Treasury's own assessments show that many investments in nature yield the highest economic returns of any form of public investment. Third, we need to redirect finance and measure what actually matters to us. You know, the financial system is sleepwalking into risk, escalating risk. The Bank of England needs to stress test nature-related risks, just as it does for climate. Major businesses should disclose these risks for an established task force for nature-related financial disclosure. And this isn't red tape. This isn't red tape, it's basic market transparency. And we have to measure what matters. You know, the UK is actually among global leaders, believe it or not, in natural capital accounting. Let's build on that. And each year we need to track the tangible risk reductions delivered by nature recovery, properties protected from flooding, heat-related deaths avoided, millions saved to the NHS and the wider economy. That's what accountability, that's what good accountability looks like in the age of climate and ecological crisis. Below all this, and very importantly, we have to cultivate a culture of care in this country. National security begins in our communities. We need nature woven back into daily life. Children learning outdoors, schools surrounded by shade and green space, cities planned as places that cool, that heal, and that connect. You know, when people have regular contact with nature, they care for it and they care for each other. That is long-term resilient nation building. Ultimately, we need to create an economy that values nature not as a resource to extract, but as a partner in prosperity. We have to stop funding its destruction, invest in its repair, and make it the foundation of our economic and security strategy. This isn't about choosing between the economy and the environment. It's about recognizing that the economy is embedded within the environment and that the health of the nation depends on the living systems that sustain us and that we are part of. Protecting nature is sound fiscal and security policy, and it's actually what the public is asking you to do. Failing to act would be a betrayal of our children and of future generations who will live with the consequences of the choices that we make now. Thank you.
Who's going to talk?
Much. So I've called this talk really looking at UK's climate policy from a scientific view. So I do apologise for the graphs that will follow. I want to start by framing the problem as I see it And it's very much that the CO2 concentrations in the environment, in the atmosphere, are rising at unprecedented rates. If we measure the concentration of carbon dioxide in parts per million, and we look at that across the last, say, 800,000 years and compare that with today, we see a plot that looks like this. Now, that has a variation in that of about 100 parts per million, going up and down, basically related to the ice ages. If we then focus in on the last 10,000 years, and that's the time when human societies have really flourished, what we see then is a pathway that is much more stable in carbon dioxide. The variation has only been about 20 parts per million in that period of time. And so we've had a very stable temperature and a very stable climate during the flourishing of our societies. If we then look at the end of this, and so this is really where we began to burn fossil fuels, in about 1850-ish. And we were about 280 parts per million by volume at that particular time. And if we look at that where we are today, we're now at 424 parts per million, almost overnight. We've gone to these ridiculously high levels, and it's rising rapidly every single year. We've driven temperatures up, approaching 1.5 degrees C warmer than at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And if we don't stop burning fossil fuels, the temperatures will just keep rising. This idea that we cut fossil fuel use doesn't help. We have to eliminate fossil fuels, or the temperatures will just keep going up. The way we've set it up at the moment, the way the site is going at the moment, we're going to see a rise of about 2 degrees centigrade or so by the middle of this century. That's very hard to imagine that we can be any less than that. But there's now a small but very real risk that we could hit 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Now, the prospects of 3 and 4 degrees centigrade of warming are absolutely dire. I mean, we cannot risk that at all. It is an extreme and unstable climate, far beyond any safe zone that has nurtured our civilization. And we're going to be seeing unprecedented societal and ecological collapse at these sorts of levels. We can see escalating geopolitical instability and rising military tensions. And there will be no real economy to talk about. There's no reduction in GDP. We'll be looking at systemic collapse. My colleagues are going to touch on some of these points in more detail later on. So what have we in the UK, and indeed most of the world, agreed to do about this? Well, in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, we came together and we signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that has 2 key articles or objectives. The first of these can be summarised as cutting emissions so as to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. And the second of these embeds the concept of international equity, whereby we're going to cut emissions fairly, with developed countries such as the UK taking a lead on this. It took us 23 years after that agreement before we finally defined what do we mean by dangerous. And the Paris Agreement defined this as staying well below 2 degrees centigrade of warming and ideally pursuing nothing more than 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. So these are the sort of commitments that we have made in the UK and indeed virtually every other country in the world. We're going to do that guided by the science and on the basis of international equity. Again, we sign up for this every single year. So with that as a backdrop, we can then start to say, well, what are the pathways of reducing our emissions that align with that sort of future? Science tells us about the scale and the timeline of cutting our emissions. Remember, these are political commitments that we've made. The science tells us that it is the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that gives us the rise in temperature. And it also gives us the global carbon budget, the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit if we're going to stay within our Paris commitments. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then quantify these carbon budgets for us to give us a really useful policy tool here. Now, I've updated the IPCC's last report up to 2026, January 2026, and with the improvements we've seen in the science since then. And if you play out the numbers here, we see that we can emit somewhere between 130 and 530 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. That means very little to most of us, I would think. That's 3 to 13 years of current emissions. 3 to 13 years. And remember, emissions are rising every single year. If we were to reduce emissions from January the 1st at a set rate every year for 1.5 degrees centigrade, now globally we would have to cut emissions by 20% every single year. And even for 2 degrees centigrade, it's 8% every year. That's 3 percentage points higher than the reduction that occurred at the peak of the COVID epidemic. That's for 2 degrees centigrade. If we drew straight lines to zero emissions from January the 1st, then we'd have to be zero emissions for 1.5 by about 2030 and zero emissions globally by about 2050, as long as we follow that straight line down. At the moment, every single month, we're using up the budget at about 2.7, for 1.5, about 2.7% of that budget every single month. And for 2 degrees centigrade, it's still 0.7% every month. I've greyed out the 1.5 here with a very heavy heart. I don't know any scientist, if you take them away from a microphone, who thinks staying below 1.5 is any longer a viable target. That is a very depressing statement to have to make. So I also want to add to this a cautionary note, and this will be touched on, I think, later. There's emerging evidence that we're warming faster than we have been previously. There's what we call higher climate sensitivity. The CO2 we put in the atmosphere is not being absorbed to quite the same level as it was previously by the biosphere. There's also, as we're cleaning up the air, taking out the air pollution, we're removing the cooling that the aerosols have provided us as well. So this only escalates the urgent need for emergency level policies. Unfortunately, in this, there is no good news. We also committed in Paris to reduce our emissions on the basis of equity. And that means we take the global carbon budget and we divide that, using the language of the Paris Agreement, between developed and developing countries. We can then ask the question of developed countries' carbon budget, how much we can emit, basically how many tons of fossil fuels we can burn. What does the UK get? What does France get, or Sweden? So focusing in here on the UK, building on some peer-reviewed work from a few years ago and updating that to January this year, then we can say for the UK we can emit somewhere around about 2 to 2.5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. Again, that means very little to many of us. That's 7 years of current UK emissions. Remember, this is for 2 degrees centigrade, not for 1.5, for 2. If we were to reduce emissions from January the 1st for the UK, we'd need reductions of about 13% every single year if we were to stay within the 2 degrees C carbon budget. This is the same pretty much for all industrialised countries. If we were to draw a straight line to zero, remember that means zero fossil fuel production, zero fossil fuels, we're talking about 2039. This is a very different agenda of what you normally get to see. Just do the maths, just do the science. Yet against this backdrop, what we hear is this sort of rhetorical stuff. There isn't a UK showing leadership. We see this for every country. I work in Sweden, they say the same thing. The UK is the first nation to have cut its emissions by 50% since 1990. However, that excludes international aviation and shipping and our imports and exports. If you include those, which of course the climate includes, then the reduction is about 20% since 1990, or 0.6% every year on average. There is no climate leadership anywhere within any of the so-called climate progressive countries in the global north. EU, France, Sweden, Denmark, the UK. Unpick it and you get a very uncomfortable narrative. Also, inequality is deeply embedded in the UK targets. If we look at the UK government and the Committee on Climate Change, it claims that the net zero 2050 target is the UK's fair role on 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. If you look at the carbon budget underpinning that, it means that the UK would get 3 times its equal per capita share. How can that possibly be fair? It's much more colonial. Even for 2 degrees centigrade, what we're planning for in the UK is not in any way fair and in line with our Paris commitments. Against this fairly depressing backdrop, I want to say, well, what would mitigation, what would reducing our emissions have to look like? And this is my main focus of work, really. Well, firstly, technology, and I'm pleased about this as an engineer, technology is absolutely a prerequisite of delivering on Paris. But after choosing to fail on climate change by our leaders for the last 30 years, it is now far from sufficient. We also need, and this is going to be very difficult for many of us here, profound shifts in our social norms. So on technology, I want to distinguish between 2 particular types of technologies here. What I've called delay technologies. These are designed to avoid effective legislation and basically maintain a thriving oil and gas industry, and timely technologies. Ones that actually work. We know they work. We've put them in place. They're out there running today. So delay technologies, I just whipped through these 3 here. New gas-fired power stations with carbon capture and storage. Blue hydrogen plants made out of gas with carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. All of these rely on the huge deployment and successful deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies, which sound wonderful. This technology has been promised by the oil and gas industry and by many of its shills for the last 30 years. Yet in 2024, according to the CCS Institute, it managed to store 0.03, under that actually, less than 0.03% of all fossil fuel emissions after 30 years of promises. All of these technologies have major issues in terms of their emissions issues in terms of their supply chain. All of them are going to be very expensive, and who's going to fund them? Not the oil and gas industry, the taxpayer, the bill payer. They are all false solutions designed to avoid meaningful legislation about cutting back on fossil fuel production and use. And they maintain a high cost, high profit, because that's what this industry is, oil and gas sector. Timely technologies, I would say these need to be deployed at a Marshall-style rate, like the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. And they're all the things we're familiar with, nothing sexy here. You know, retrofitting our homes, making sure our new houses, new homes that we build are zero carbon, the rapid rollout of public transport, EV charging for the rural environments, much less so for cities, and rapid shift to zero carbon electricity and a major program of electrification. Remember, electricity in the UK is only 18% of our energy consumption. 82% is not electricity, it's basically just direct fossil fuels. So when people say we're doing well in the UK, that's only on electricity, which is only 18% of our energy. We also need to have deep and rapid cuts in the use of aviation, a very large sector in the UK, and there is nothing you can do technically about that sector to reduce emissions in a 1.5 to 2 degrees C timeline. Shipping, there are some things like slow steaming, and there are some technologies out there as well. But all this takes time, and in the interim, we have to have profound change in the social norms. This is difficult for many of us here, I suspect, because we need to focus on the high-income, high-emitting people, and I think, with a few exceptions, no doubt, that's us. Why is fairness key? Well, globally, collectively, the top 1% of global emitters have lifestyles that give rise to twice the level of the bottom half of the world's population. It's quite hard to actually grasp what that differential is. But you come to the UK, the lifestyles of the high-income households require nearly 5 times more energy than the lowest-income households. And I'm guessing that most of us, or many of us here, live in those households or aspire to. So on responsibility, let's be absolutely clear, we're not all in this together. Most UK households are locked into structural emissions. The rubbish house, the inefficient car, the poor heating system, the old fridge. They can't afford to buy their way out of the emissions. And anyway, they're not responsible for most of the emissions. We are. The discretionary emissions that are locked into the lives of us high-income, high-emitters. And this is where we need urgent legislation to drive down energy use within that particular group. And I would argue that the second prerequisite of Paris is that fair and deep reductions in energy use are that second prerequisite. So it's technology, and then it's driving down demand. This would deliver immediate and substantial cuts in emissions. It buys us critical time to put in place the zero carbon sort of technologies that are available. And it releases, very importantly, the labour, the materials, the finance, and even the political capital we need to drive the clean revolution. Responding to climate change is win-win-win for majority. So if you think about it, we need to have comfortable, affordable, low-carbon homes, high-quality public transport. And putting these in place will provide huge amounts of secure and valued employment, better air quality, better health, therefore better educational attainment for our children in schools, a functioning infrastructure, and I would argue an improved sense of civic well-being. But, and this is the rub for those of us here, to do that means we've got to move the resources and labour that furnish the private luxury of a relative few of us, people like me and many of us here, to the public well-being for all, to a future of private sufficiency and public luxury, away from the idea of small private luxury for a few and public squalor that we've got used to recently. So what does all this mean for policymakers? Well, actually, I think the IPCC, in the Working Group 2, in the response to a frequently asked question, answered this really quite succinctly. Targeting a climate-resilient world, sustainable world, involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political economic systems, and power relationships. And that captures, really, I think, the essence of the scale of change that we require. It is my view that it is now too late for non-radical futures. I see no way out of revolutionary rates of change in how we, particularly groups of us, live today. The choice is between a deep, rapid and fair decarbonisation of modern society, an organised-ish technical and social revolution, or ongoing rhetoric and delay as temperatures exceed dangerous for all, and they will have revolutionary scales of change that will be both chaotic and violent. I'm going to close with a quote from Robert Unger, a Brazilian politician and philosopher, which I regularly use. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it will be different. So, thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. So we've heard that 1.5 is gone, that 2 degrees is dangerous, that 3 degrees is unthinkable. We've heard that it's too late for non-radical solutions, and we've heard that we are being distracted by some bogus solutions when we need to cut the fossil fuel. Now over to Professor Hayley Fowler, who's going to tell us about extreme weather.
Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking today in my professional capacity as an academic at Newcastle University. In September 2024, Storm Boris caused record-breaking rainfall across 6 countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It overwhelmed rivers, it caused multiple dam collapses and destructive flood waves, and damages exceeded €2 billion. Storm Boris isn't an isolated case. Europe's been hit again and again by severe floods in recent years. Do you remember Germany in 2021? Nearly 200 people were killed in one of the deadliest European floods in decades. The same weather system triggered those dangerous flash floods in London. And in Valencia in October 2024, 3/4 of a metre of rain fell in just 24 hours. It caused flooding that claimed 220 lives. Storm Daniel in 2023 inundated Greece. It flooded 1/5 of its agricultural land. And then it intensified into a medicane, that's a Mediterranean hurricane, and it killed over 5,000 people in Libya. These events are not warnings of what might happen in the future. They're actually examples of what's happening right now. So what's happening to our weather? I grew up in a small village in the Peak District. Winters meant deep snow, school closures, and summers were warm but rarely hot. But the climate we live in today is not the same as when I was born. In those 50 years, our use of fossil fuels has dramatically increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These trap extra heat, loading the atmosphere with more moisture. It drives warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and it supercharges extremes, storms, downpours, which increase much faster than average weather. By 2050, 1 in 4 properties, 8 million in England, will be at risk of flooding. And new research by my group shows that UK winter rainfall has increased by 10% since 1980 because of the fossil fuels we're putting into the atmosphere. Now, an extra 30 millimetres of rainfall each winter sounds really small, but across the UK, that's 7.3 billion cubic metres of extra water. It's the same as 3 million Olympic-sized swimming pools, with an effect on flooding. This trend is some 25 years ahead of global climate model predictions, and that's concerning. The extreme heat of 19th of July 2022, you'll remember that. My garden in Newcastle upon Tyne was 37.6 degrees that day. Astonishing. Across the UK, records were shattered. Temperatures over 40 degrees were recorded for the first time. It caused around 3,000 excess deaths. Now, the Met Office says there's a 4% chance already of another 40 degrees C day next year, and that probability is rising really fast. In fact, heat waves in Europe are intensifying faster than anywhere in the world and much faster than climate models predict. Hot, dry summers threaten our water security as well. Many of you will have noticed this year. They overstretch healthcare systems, and they bring a new danger to the UK, wildfires. These now happen on heathlands, forests, even on the edges of cities. And earlier this year, a wildfire in Dorset was so severe that 17 fire services had to respond. UK fire services no longer have the resources to keep the public safe in extreme heat, and as heat waves get longer and hotter, fires will become more common. But what we're seeing in today's extreme weather isn't random. It's linked to changes in the mid-latitude jet that drives weather systems over the UK. The jet stream is becoming increasingly unstable. The Arctic's warming 4 times faster than the global mean, and this weakens the temperature gradient between the equator and the pole. This difference is actually what powers the jet. A weaker jet can become wavier and slower. And when these large meanders get stuck in place, they create what we call blocking patterns, which stall weather systems over the same region for days or even weeks. So what we see are heat waves that persist for longer, fueling wildfires. We see slow-moving storms triggering these catastrophic floods. And we saw this vividly in the summer of 2021. A record-shattering heat wave in Western North America, huge floods in Western Europe and China, and extreme heat and wildfires in Siberia. Different regions, different hazards, but the same underlying driver, a block jet that traps weather systems. And we see this pattern repeating again and again. But climate models underestimate these block jet stream events, and they likely underestimate their future occurrence. So I'm often asked, could these European-style megafloods happen here? The honest answer is yes. There's no physical reason why not. These storms can produce 2/3 of a year's rainfall in just a couple of days. So over London, that would mean about 35 centimetres of rainfall falling over a large area. So to put that into perspective, that's 3 times the rain that fell in Monmouth during Storm Claudia earlier this month. A flood of this scale would be a national crisis. But like people in Germany, we can't imagine it until it happens. So, can you imagine fast-moving, metres-deep water tearing through low-lying streets into your front room? The overwhelmed sewers spilling into that water, transport networks shutting down, cars and even houses swept away, and imagine power outages cascading into communication failures. And a lot of this might happen when it's dark. Recovery wouldn't take weeks, it would take years. And there's also a structural risk we can't ignore. England has over 2,000 raised reservoirs, many built more than a century ago and designed for what was then a 1 in 1,000-year rainfall event. But these extremes are no longer rare. The probability of dam overtopping is increasing. Our infrastructure was designed for a climate that no longer exists. And imagine if a Storm Boris-scale event struck the UK today, could we manage it? I've focused so far on extreme weather in Europe, but countries in the global south have been living with greater impacts for years. What's changed now is how fast these extremes are escalating. Take Pakistan. In May 2024, temperatures in Sindh reached 52 degrees C. At that temperature, when combined with high humidity, the human body can't anymore cool itself. A healthy person resting in the shade can die within hours. We're now approaching this limit to human survivability in parts of South Asia. And extreme events in the global breadbaskets are causing spikes in food prices. My colleague, Professor Behrens, will explain why food security can no longer be taken for granted. In the UK, we import roughly half our food and around 40% of our energy from overseas, so global weather extremes are a direct risk to families here at home, to the economy, and to national security. Yet the UK is not prepared. The Climate Change Committee's latest assessment is very clear. The UK is not adapting fast enough to a rapidly changing climate. Despite having a national adaptation plan, progress on the ground is far too slow. Across all sectors assessed, not a single outcome was rated as being delivered at a good level. Meanwhile, the risks are growing rapidly, as I've shown. The committee highlights 3 major gaps: weak governance, unclear responsibilities, and insufficient funding. They recommend that adaptation needs to be mainstreamed and embedded into key government decisions, spending reviews, and infrastructure planning. Adaptation plans must deliver at pace, with the resources to back them up. But in the UK, we're still building infrastructure that isn't resilient to today's climate, never mind tomorrow's. And we're not adequately addressing cascading climate risks and failures either. So imagine a windstorm knocks out power. It shuts down pumping stations, cutting off water supply for days. Communication networks are affected. Roads become impassable. Emergency services can't get through. This is not something that's happening in the future. This systemic disruption already happened in Storm Arwen, and it's becoming more common. And what if another event hits before services recover? We risk sliding into a state of permanent crisis management, always reacting, never catching up. Every year we delay urgent investment in resilience and emissions reductions, the window for successful action gets smaller. But we can imagine a better future. First, we need urgent action to cut emissions. It's sobering when you realise that this is the least extreme climate you will experience in your lifetime. I'll let that sink in. Until we stop burning fossil fuels, extreme weather will continue to get worse. So cutting emissions isn't enough. It isn't a choice. We must also adapt to protect people and livelihoods. And that means upgrading flood defences and drainage to cope with more intense rainfall, retrofitting homes to withstand extreme heat and cold, stress testing critical infrastructure so it keeps going during extreme events, investing in modern early warning systems to save lives, and building local resilience in communities. A safer future is still possible, but it requires urgency, coordination, and sustained investment. The good news is that adaptation doesn't just keep us safe, it improves well-being. So insulation doesn't just protect people from extreme temperatures, it cuts energy bills, reduces emissions, it improves health, especially for people in low-quality housing. And planting trees and building flood-absorbing parks not only reduces flood risk, but it cools cities, it cleans the air, and it gives people green spaces that boost well-being and biodiversity. Take Copenhagen. After being hit by devastating floods in 2011, the city reinvented itself as a sponge. Streets now divert water from homes, and parks transform into temporary lakes during storms. The result is a city that's greener, healthier, and far more livable. And adaptation pays for itself. Every pound we invest now saves many more pounds in avoided damage and disruption, and it also creates skilled jobs. Adaptation is a triple win. Good for the economy, good for communities, and good for nature. So to close, extreme weather is not a future problem. It's already changed significantly. It's getting worse fast, and we're not prepared. But we have an opportunity for change. We have the science to understand what's happening, the tools to build resilience, and we know what works. But what we need now is the courage to commit to urgent action. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. So we're exposed here and now to catastrophic risks in the UK, and that could take years to recover from. And during that time, we might have similar events happening all over again. So now we move on to hear from Professor Tim Lenton about tipping points.
Thanks for being here. I'm Tim. I'll walk you through why, if we carry on the current trajectory to 3 or maybe 4 degrees of warming later this century, then we'll definitely be in a national emergency, because we'll be at a high level of likelihood of crossing a tipping point in the climate that will make this country a very different place and less habitable place to be. And that we've only really got one credible way out of that kind of risk and trouble. If you're wondering what a tipping point is, you could just lean back on your chair to that balance point where you know that a small change is going to make a big difference to your state or your fate. There'll be a self-propelling change from one stable state of the system to another. What I'm doing in the little movie here is a bit more subtle. We've got a system that's got two different stable states like the chair. It's in the one on the left, but we're forcing it in a way that that initial state gets less and less stable, less resilient, until at some point some strong amplifiers in the system support a self-propelling change from one state to another. What are the qualities of that tipping point change? Well, it's pretty abrupt, as you can see. It's self-propelling. I didn't have to keep forcing the system. It would just carry on under its own momentum. And it's pretty difficult to reverse once it's underway. Now, tipping points can happen in all kinds of complex systems, including the climate and the economy and societies. There's a bunch of tipping points in the climate that I've spent 20-odd years kind of documenting and telling everybody about. There's plenty, sadly, of evidence that, as we'll see, that we're heading towards several of these tipping points. They also interact. We're living in a beautiful, complex, almost living Earth system where tipping one thing can affect the likelihood of tipping another. And unfortunately, this system is wired up in a way where it's more often the case that tipping one thing makes tipping another more likely. So we've heard about unprecedented warming of the Arctic. That's causing a bunch of consequences, including the accelerated melt of the Greenland ice sheet. We've got fresh water pouring off the Greenland ice sheet. That's one of the things, along with that Arctic warming, that's contributing to a measured slowdown in the great overturning circulation of the Atlantic Ocean, which we'll come back to in a minute, because that's the big risk for us if that tips. And so on. I won't run through all of these interactions. The problem is we risk, at the worst case, a bad tipping cascade where we lose control, essentially, of the climate problem, and we've got damaging changes just propelling one another. So we recently published our Global Tipping Points Report 2025, telling the world that whilst we're here at about 1.4 degrees centigrade of global warming at the moment and heading to 1.5 around 2030, we've already crossed a tipping point for the world's coral reef ecosystems that support the livelihoods of around 500 million people and protect many coastlines from rising sea levels and storm surges. We met in Belém in the Amazon in the knowledge that we are now, as we head over 1.5 degrees C of global warming in the near future, at risk of tipping a loss of the Amazon rainforest that isn't just a catastrophe for nature, but it adds a lot of carbon to the atmosphere and removes a lot of reflective cloud cover, so it adds to global warming for all of us. But I want to concentrate on the things that are in the middle, some big risks we're already running of tipping points where we'd essentially stop two key parts of what a process we call the formation of deep water in the North Atlantic Ocean. And then this causes ultimately a tipping point and a thing that we esoterically call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC for short. But you really want to know about this, so just remember the acronym AMOC. We've all heard of the Gulf Stream, and hopefully you recognize that as part of the red warm water flow heading northeastwards across the North Atlantic. But you can see it's part of this bigger loop, a sort of red to blue loop, which is the great overturning, we call it, circulation of the Atlantic. So this red thing is a surface current heading northwards, transporting masses of heat to where we are and giving us our nice, mild, equable climate, especially winters. But you see, either side of Greenland, something happens called deep water formation. Those waters that are heading north, they're losing heat and they're evaporating fresh water to the atmosphere. That makes them colder and saltier and therefore denser. And either side of Greenland, they get so dense that these waters sink from the top of the ocean to thousands of meters down. And that propels the blue path, which is cold water heading back thousands of meters down in the bottom of the Atlantic and closing the loop. If you lose the deep water formation, you can tip off this great overturning, and I'll show you in a minute what that will do to our climate. We already know this circulation is weakening. We know it's switched on and off without human activities 25 times during the last ice age. We know the dramatic changes in climate that wrought to our part of the world. And unfortunately, this circulation can pass and does pass a tipping point in a bunch of the state-of-the-art climate models that we run. I'll just show you an example of one of them. In this one, it's happened at around 2 degrees centigrade of global warming. On the right, you're seeing a remarkable comeback of the Arctic sea ice cover that happens if we cross this tipping point, with the sea ice reaching down to the wash and covering most of the North Sea by February each winter. On the left, there's some information about what the decadal winter climate extremes will be if we've crossed this tipping point. In London, it's minus 20 degrees C and 3 frozen months of the year. And in Edinburgh, it's minus 30 degrees C and 5.5 frozen months of the year. And yet the summers will still be hotter than today because it's a 2 degrees warmer world, not a 1.4 degrees warmer world. So the seasonality of the UK, the climate, is like nothing we've ever seen before. It's radically increased. We've previously looked at what would this do to some basic things like land use and food production. And the simple version is it eliminates the possibility to grow crops in the UK. So instead of being a bit over 50% dependent on food imports, we'll be perhaps nearer 100%. But that's possibly the least of our worries, because there'd be a major water security crisis. We calculate that there'd be not enough water from the winters to get through the summers in the southeast of England, where most of the people are, like us today. And then in the global context, this is a simple calculation of what passing this tipping point does for the viable areas for growing 2 major staple crops, wheat and maize worldwide, and they're reduced by more than a half. So it's a global food security crisis. So the overarching message from that, we're running an increasing risk of these tipping points, including this critical one for the UK. That risk goes up markedly with every fraction of a degree of warming and every year over 1.5 degrees C. So we've got to do everything in our power to limit the amount of time we spend over 1.5 degrees C and the amount of temperature we go over 1.5. My closing case to you is going to be that requires a radical acceleration of action towards zero emissions. And the only way we can really convince ourselves that that's credible is if I can convince you that there are also what I call positive tipping points, where the change towards zero emissions technologies and behaviours can itself become self-accelerating. So it's just like the original movie. There are different stable states of the economy and society. We're in this predominantly fossil-fueled state of the economy, but we can all picture a different economy and society powered by clean, renewable energy and a bunch of other things besides. There's certainly a barrier or a hilltop between those two states, but we've already seen how in some sectors and in some nations how actions, including policy actions, can lower the hilltop, can destabilize the fossil fuel status quo, and can activate amplifiers within the system that then create a self-propelling change from the old emitting, dirty way of doing things to the clean, low emissions way of doing things. And we've done that in the UK. We've done it in the power sector, at least. So the black line is coal burning, contribution to UK power electricity production. At the peak in 2012, we got 40% of our electricity from coal burning. How much do we get today? 0, because we've shut the last coal burning power station. Woo! Yeah. How did that tipping point happen? Well, we had a Climate Change Act and a cross-party consensus and a commitment and incentives to do the rollout of new renewables, the green, the blue, the yellow here, that now give us more than 40% of our electricity. But the falling off the cliff for coal burning also happens because something called a floor price on carbon was levied just on the power sector with the promise from the government that it would only be ever stepped up over time, and it was a pretty modest price, but it was enough to make coal burning become unprofitable. Then people start withdrawing investment from it, which makes it even less profitable, and you get a self-amplifying tipping point. In the global context, clearly we need to do more than just positively tip to clean energy. The power sector is about a quarter of global emissions. We need to tip things like home heating that we've heard about. We need to electrify personal transport and goods transport. There's 4 sectors there: power, cars, if you like, trucks, home heating. In state-of-the-art modelling, we model 72 world regions, hundreds of different technologies, the coupling between sectors, the way that feedbacks are reinforcing change between the sectors. There's a lot of information on the slide, but the take-home message from it is, if we want to see positive tipping points in across these crucial sectors that make up a large fraction of total emissions, then the most effective policies to bring them forwards are mandates to phase out the fossil fuel technology and phase in the clean technology. So we're talking here about the ban on petrol and diesel car sales from 2030. We're talking about correspondingly would be banning gas boilers from a point in the future, banning diesel trucks from 2040. What that does is it activates the amplifiers in the system that we've all should be witnessing in the global economy, which is the more we adopt the clean technology, the better and the cheaper it gets. We're already in a world where the renewables are, together with battery storage, the cheapest source of electricity worldwide. Electrification of transport is rapidly becoming the cheapest and the best option. We need the policies that bring forward the positive tipping points that can accelerate us out of trouble. So it's a narrative of kind of from emergency or peril to prosperity. This message is, I think, fairly easy to summarise. I think I've shown you the risks we're running, both in a global and in a national sense, of crossing some tipping points in the climate. And I've emphasised this tipping point in the Atlantic Ocean circulation. I probably should have told you that if we go anywhere near 2 degrees centigrade, then the odds of crossing that tipping point are definitely worse than Russian roulette, which is 1 bullet out in the 6 canisters of the gun. And that tipping point will be at least as likely as not if we go anywhere near 3 degrees of global warming. So we have to limit warming, or do our bit to limit warming globally if we want to limit that, I think, emergency risk for the UK. And we need civil society, us, and policy working together to trigger the tipping points, the positive tipping points that can limit that risk and accelerate us to a clean and more prosperous future together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. So we've been hearing about these tipping points, which you barely hear about in the news. We've heard about very negative tipping points and even more about the danger of 2 degrees, and we've heard about positive tipping points. And actually what we're trying to achieve today, the challenge is, can we together create a societal tipping point right now? Well, we've been hearing a lot of information, but it's not enough just to listen to it. We have to integrate it into our wider understanding of the world, and we have to start to process it. So now might be a very good time just for a moment to reflect on how this is landing with you. Just think about that, and if you like to, just for a few seconds now, just turn to somebody next to you and tell them something about your reaction to what you have heard so far. Okay, I'm going to cut you off. I'm so sorry to cut you off so quickly. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we've got a lot to get through. And the energy in the room tells us we really do have to bring the room back down again because we've got much more to hear about today. Isn't it interesting, as you all finish your conversations, isn't it interesting how much energy there is to discuss and explore what we've heard today, but we've got much, much more to hear just now. So we're going to move on and start hearing about the implications that some of this has for us here in the UK. So I'd like to introduce you to Professor Paul Behrens, who's going to talk to you about food security. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Mike. I'm going to tell you about a threat that will affect everyone in this room, every family in this country, and every constituent. A threat for which we are woefully unprepared. And I'm talking about the increasing pressure on global food supplies in the face of accelerating climate change and nature loss. This is what happens when food systems fail. Empty supermarket shelves, people queuing for hours for food, protests and civil unrests. In Syria, drought-driven agricultural collapse preceded civil war, and we've seen climate fingerprints on many of the civilizational collapses in history. For generations, a stable climate has given us reliable harvests. But that era, as we've heard, is gone. We are facing an increasingly chaotic system. So we're talking droughts, floods, wildfires, and heat extremes that are all increasing. And these, by the way, are all pictures from the UK. But what's exceptionally damaging is when they strike together, especially in global breadbaskets. One study in a top journal found that before climate change, a major corn harvest failure might happen once every 16 years. At 1.5 degrees of warming, that rises to once every 3 years. At 2 degrees, it's once every other year. And it's not just corn, but other crops like soy. And in fact, projections suggest that even though we see some areas become available for agriculture as the world warms, overall, we'll lose around a third of the land suitable for food by the end of this century. And these impacts aren't abstract. They're starting to hit home. Britain has seen 3 of the 5 worst cereal harvests on record occur this decade. This is Colin Chappell, a 4th-generation arable farmer in Lincolnshire during the flooding of 2023, who said, "I was farming water. I wasn't farming soil. My dad got flooded once in 1981. But since 2000, I've lost count of the amount of times that I've been flooded." He also went on to say, "I'll be open and honest. I don't know how we'll get through next year. If I get one more bad year, that's it. We're gone." And over 80% of farmers say that climate change is seriously threatening their ability to make a living. And on top of this, we're deeply dependent on the rest of the world, importing around 40 to 50% of our food. And much of this from regions that are hammered themselves by the climatic impacts that we've been talking about. From olive oil to beef, from cocoa to coffee, we're seeing impacts everywhere. And of these imports, around 25% come from the Mediterranean, especially vital vegetables and fruits. And these are regions that are also experiencing dramatic climatic impacts and likely desertification as we move through the decades. But perhaps what concerns me most isn't the direct food availability in the UK, although we may see some short-term limits. It's that we see food price inflation and what that means for people already struggling. So one estimate suggests that about a third of the food price inflation that we saw in 2023 was driven by extreme weather events that are now becoming the norm. And when families can't afford to feed their children, societies break down. We see this all the time. Climate change is already contributing to our febrile political atmosphere in this country when we think about the cost of living crisis. And the food industry itself is alarmed. UK food executives have warned that the sector is on course for pronounced shortages and business failures, saying, "We've reached a moment of threat to our food security like none other we have seen." And when food security experts are asked about UK civil unrest driven by food supply crises, 40% say it's possible within a decade on our current path. And 80% say that it's possible within 50 years. And yet, our agricultural policies barely acknowledge these risks. And worse still, the food system itself is damaging the very foundations of our food security. It's a large driver of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, drives catastrophic habitat loss, pollutes our water, pollutes our air, depletes our fresh water, drives antimicrobial resistance, and creates the conditions for the emergence of new pandemics. So in short, the system that feeds us and that we rely upon is actually also undermining the foundations that we depend upon. The good news is that the research is crystal clear on what we need to do, and, fortunately, it's healthier for us. We need a great food transformation built on 4 main pillars: shifting to plant-rich diets, reducing food waste, improving production, and increasing climate resilience. But one of these pillars is much bigger than the others: a shift to healthy, plant-rich diets. In the UK, animal agriculture occupies around 85% of total agricultural land, shown in green here proportionally. And animals drive most of the problems that I just mentioned. And this is just simply not resilient, because in a climate and nature-constrained world, with a shrinking agricultural safe space, this is simply unsustainable. Research from our team and many others across the UK show that healthy, sustainable diets can still include some meat and dairy, just far less of it. So we're thinking about a red meat burger once every 2 weeks, which is still within the range of diets of many British families. It means a chicken breast once a week and a quarter of a pint of dairy each day, maybe a bit of cheese. Now, I know this can be politically difficult to talk about, but we have to be straight with people about the choices ahead. Because if we don't lead this change on the front foot, we'll be forced into this change anyway as food shocks intensify and as animals are hit harder by climate change than the crops. And if we can... And if we can be on the front foot, this is where the story becomes one of extraordinary opportunity. Plant-rich diets, like the ones I've just described, gives us win-wins across every dimension. I've put a little counter here to keep us track of the wins, because there's quite a few that's going to come up here. So, our work shows that we would reduce our agricultural emissions about 60%. We'd also find that we spare an area almost the size of Scotland across the UK. This is a before and after of an upland valley showing what could be done on the land. It could mean more nature, storing huge amounts of carbon, helping to meet our climate targets, helping to meet our nature targets, improving our flood resilience. Just imagine the flood resilience on the left here compared to the right. It would improve our dire mental health outcomes, as we've just heard from Natalie, by increasing our access to nature. Or even for other direct economic uses, for forestry, for timber buildings, for bioplastics. We dramatically increase our water quality and our air quality, saving lives and nature. We'd also have healthier diets, improving productivity, and saving tens or even hundreds of billions of pounds each year. When New York hospitals made their foods plant-rich by default, they found a greater satisfaction among patients, better health outcomes, and bigger budget savings. Now, one estimate puts it at the NHS saving £55 million a year just in catering costs alone. I talked before about threats to food supply, but this is how we can create climate resilience. We can use some of that spared land to grow more of the food we need here in the UK. It will cut over-reliance on imports, and you can feed many more people per hectare on a plant-rich diet. In our research, we find that the UK could be largely self-sufficient in many major crops if we made this shift. Lastly, and importantly, farmers like Colin Chappell, who we heard from earlier, across Britain are clamouring for security. They want their work valued. They want viable livelihoods. And they are essential partners. And in fact, our research shows that their income could increase if we do this right, cutting down on the products that lose money and being paid fairly to deliver the nature and climate outcomes we desperately need. The result would be turning around the trends in dire mental health outcomes reported by UK farmers, and especially for animal farmers who report poorer mental health in general as they have less time off as they can't leave their animals. This shift would allow farmers to be true stewards of nature and spark a rural renaissance. Now, this is not the only selection of wins. I'm sure you can think of many others, including in animal welfare, but I've only got a few minutes left. You can add your own in your own time. It's not only scientists that see this opportunity. In the 1990s, Denmark bet big on wind energy and created a world-leading clean tech industry. And the Danes have seen the way the wind is blowing in agriculture, and they're taking the same approach with a plant-rich action plan, investing in plants along the food supply chain from farmers to chefs. And they're aiming to spur growth and make billions in plant-rich exports. There are other changes we need to improve food security. The National Preparedness Commission has highlighted many vital steps, from treating food as a critical infrastructure and moving away from these just-in-time logistics and towards food storage strategies. And these will become even more important as climate change bites. Although changes in the food system can seem hard, we're not starting from scratch. We have the excellent National Food Strategy with excellent recommendations across the board. We have international allies moving towards plant-rich food systems. There are obvious difficulties in shifting public perception around eating more plants, although pretty much everybody knows it's better for us. We must bring people on board, and there is plenty of research to support us on this journey. Overall, we've got to place the focus on eating high-fibre, whole food plants for the sake of our own health, but also for the planet's health. So we face a choice. We can continue with business as usual, watching our food systems crumble, watching the costs rise, our resilience erode, and then bracing ourselves for political and civil unrest. Or we can act now to improve our health, our environment, our rural livelihoods, our communities, along with improving our ability to roll with the punches of climate change. We'll look back and wonder why we didn't make these changes sooner. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Paul. So we're under real threat to our food security here in the UK right now, and the solutions are there to be had with a plant-based diet leading the list of practical actions right now. So now over to Professor Hugh Montgomery to tell us about health implications here in the UK. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I'd echo the thanks given earlier to our political leaders, the MPs in the room. Thank you very, very much for being here. Your leadership is noted. I work in climate change, but I'm an NHS lifer. I'm a barefoot doctor working in a North London intensive care unit. And my day job is emergencies, whether it's global pandemics, or 7/7 events such as this, terrorist attacks, or the more mundane, the people who come in acutely unwell on any one of the days of the week. I know what an emergency looks like, and I know how you respond to an emergency. And you don't respond to emergencies with talk and homeopathy. You respond with genuine action. These are the sorts of patients I deal with. And it's not just that I recognise an emergency and what to do. I have to have honest conversations. Those honest conversations might be, there is nothing I can do to help your loved one or you, and that your loved one or you are going to die. Sometimes it's, this is what we must do to save your life. Are you up for the pain and suffering that will take to get you to that end? And I'm used to having conversations about risk and hazard. The risk of, let's say, a lifestyle, such as smoking, that might be bad for you, to say the risks, the likelihood of a bad thing happening are going up by you doing this. I would strongly suggest we help you not to do that thing. But I'm also used to explaining what the hazard of that is. Not just the chance of it happening, but what the bad thing looks like. The suffering that it might cause you, and the fact that if that bad thing happens, I might not actually be able to do anything about it. And believe it or not, until around 15 years ago, human impacts of climate change weren't even being discussed. Full stop. They weren't even in the international negotiating texts. And I was part of this commission that made this statement, that climate change was the greatest threat to human health of the 21st century. We were pointing out the risk, but we weren't adequately pointing out the hazard, because I don't think anymore it's about risk. It's about survival. It's about the survival not of future generations, but of my son, who was 20 last Sunday. Why? Well, I could talk you through what we originally plotted in the Lancet Countdown, which we now publish. It's an over 50-country, 128 scientist report coming out every single year, and it maps 20 indicators of the health hazards of climate change. This year's report, 12 of those 20 broke records of hazard. They get worse every year. Why? Well, because we end up with these sorts of consequences for climate change. You've had many of them alluded to earlier on. And those cause downstream impacts, such as these. Those cause health consequences, and you can start mapping what those are. They're changes, for instance, to respiratory health, to asthma or COPD coming from fires, for instance, or high pollen burden. We get changes in communicable disease. But I'm guessing most of you looking at that aren't terribly frightened by that. And if I'm completely honest, neither am I. Because whilst we get those things coming here now, and whilst they're hitting people abroad very hard, we're not really seeing them. And humans aren't wired to manage indeterminate, medium-term risk from activities they find currently pleasurable. That's why use of cigarettes, drugs, unprotected sex, alcohol, all continue, because they're all great fun now. Although, as one of my fellows once said, not necessarily in that order. And they're associated with risk. This is the problem. As Professor Sir Michael Marmot pointed out, the social determinants of health aren't just an adjunct to health. They're the main driver of disease, suffering, and death. And that doesn't matter if you're in a poor, resource-poor country, or you're in a wealthier nation such as ours. The major driver of disease we see is due to the social determinants of health. Come visit my intensive care unit, you will see that writ big. And this is what scares the living daylights out of me. Because these sorts of climate impacts, of which we've just heard from other experts, drive catastrophic downstream changes which affect our socioeconomic systems in this sort of way. Paul alluded to the fact that the Kazakh grain crop collapse, and then the heat waves around Syria led to the insurgent masses moving into the Syrian capital, destabilizing it, the triggering of Arab Springs and so forth, very well documented. You're going to hear more about that later. But these are the problems. Without a functioning economy, without food supply available to us, we cannot run a health service, we cannot have health. And I'm not going to be trying to give everyone else's talks, but let's just pick up on a few of those issues. We're losing somewhere around $10,000 a second to extreme weather events, to ones we definitely can attribute to climate change. We're already at around $4,500 a second being lost to the global economy. And as you've heard, things don't stop if we just stop emitting. Heating will continue. We're committed to a loss of 20% of the global economy already. That is going to be gone, and it will be gone now in a little over 20 years. Moving forwards, economists are warning us we may lose 50% or north of our global economy. Without that, we don't have an education system. We sure as hell don't have a health service. This isn't just the scientists. Let's look at what actuaries say. The actuaries, the people who do the maths, or math if you're American, on the risk faced by insurance companies. I won't read that out to you. These are statements directly from actuaries. As they pointed out in the foreword to their report, this isn't some minor rounding error. We heard Paul talking about food, and he alluded to this report from Food Seniors. So this isn't just coming from scientists like Tim and others. It's not coming from just ecologists, such as Chris Packham. It's not just coming from actuaries and from food industry people as well as academics. It's coming across the suite. And that was summarised in the State of the Climate report from last year, which made the following statements. So I recognise an emergency. This is one. We have not been treating it as one. We've had these sorts of warnings too, which we ignored. Not that this might upset our tummies a bit with a bit of salmonella, or that we might get dengue. There may be no livable future for us and our children. The point was made earlier. We haven't got time for doing a little bit of recycling. We need transformational change now, if we're going to survive. There are some policy wins, because as we also pointed out in one of the Lancet Commissions, action on climate change brings great benefits economically and to health as well. And Paul has alluded to some of those. If you look, for instance, at active transport and getting rid of particulate pollution, but using physical activity to move, getting rid of gas boilers and so forth, which reduces particulate pollution, and moving to the plant-based diet that Paul alluded to, you get wins on all of these sorts of disease states, which are the bread and butter in every hospital in the country, for which your taxes pay. We can transform the health of the nation, and we can make our NHS actually sustainable in its own right. There are huge wins if we change to active transport, quite modestly, by changes in policy. So these are fiscal wins, whether you're to the right or the left of the political agenda. This just makes sense. If we look at the food, to which Paul alluded, the impacts on respiratory health, cancers, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and more. If we make these moves to the WHO recommended diet, the plant-based diet, we get longer lives, lower emissions, and enormous cash savings. And if you just look at the contribution to obesity, if we fix that, that would save this country £126 billion a year. That's enough to take 12% off the base rate of income tax. So, I'm going to finish. We've had an honest conversation. I am scared. I'm 63. I may not have that much longer left on the planet, but I'm scared for my own life and future, and I'm absolutely terrified for that of my son, and you should be too. Is this an emergency? It is an emergency. Now it is an emergency, and it requires deep action. This is no longer a risk. Without action, these impacts are certainties, and the hazards are catastrophic. If we take action, we might survive to leave the hospital. If we do not, the outcome is absolutely certain. So I leave you with this thought. The climate emergency is a health emergency, and it's about time we started treating this one.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. So it's an absolute emergency, but we're not treating it as one. And we said at the start that everything you hear today is connected to everything else. And it's when we've just heard that it's when you start joining things up and looking systemically that things start getting really worrying. And it's also when you start looking at things systemically that the huge benefits of doing the right thing start becoming, mind-boggling. And just some of the numbers we saw there, absolutely huge. So, okay, let's have a look at national security for us here in the UK. So, very pleased to welcome to the stage Lieutenant General Richard Newgie to tell us about that. Thank you, Richard.
You've just heard about food security and health, the foundations of a functioning and functional society. So I want to add the next level, if you like. What does this matter to our national security? I spent over 35 years in the army serving in, among other places, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Even 5 to 10 years ago, if you'd raised climate change in the MOD, most people would nod politely, move on, with even a couple of top officials telling me, we're exempt climate change. I didn't have a good answer for that originally. I came up with one a bit later. But that has now changed. The MOD is now looking at environmental impacts with a team working on climate security, energy self-sufficiency for our forces, and how they can adapt to a rapidly changing planet. The Chief of Defence Staff is engaged. Other countries and NATO are doing the same, factoring climate into national security. Why? Because the threat picture is shifting faster than we expected and faster than we anticipated. In this more complicated and contested world, we have had a clear steer. And whilst you may not be able to read all of that, they're direct quotes from the Strategic Defence Review. We must be better prepared for the threats coming towards us in this country. And they are not just military. They're threats to the fabric of this great country of ours, which require action. The Strategic Defence Review calls for a whole-of-society approach. Now, many of you will know what NATO Article 5 says, an attack on one is an attack on all. But NATO Article 3 stresses the need for each country's ability to withstand and recover from all types of shock, whether they're military, natural disasters, or other crises. And common sense demands a resilient homeland from all threats, from cyberspace, where we're being attacked daily, air, land, sea, or space. Imagine if you didn't have GPS, you didn't have the internet. Or, of course, from climate change. Climate change can be thought of as a threat multiplier, making existing threats worse or more frequent, and introducing new threats. Climate shocks fuel global instability. When farmers can no longer earn a living, they're recruited by non-state actors. And we saw this in Afghanistan, and we saw this with ISIS in Iraq. Competition for water, food and land is rising. We see this in tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia. Now the Egyptians have somebody to blame if the Nile fails, not something. And potential flashpoints already seen involving Pakistan, India, and China. Climate impacts make livelihoods impossible in some areas, and you've heard that about how the combination of 50 degrees, which I was fighting in Iraq, and 100% humidity renders the human body impossible to act. I can tell you it is extremely unpleasant, and most of my soldiers couldn't cope with it. And just as an aside, I had no casualties from my battle group of over 1,000 in Iraq from the enemy. We were a successful battle group. But I had 5 returned to UK for heat stroke. And I used in that battle group of 1,000, 250 drips to keep people alive. That was the real killer for my battle group in Iraq, not the enemy. I was lucky. People are forced to move within countries and across borders. That puts pressure on receiving regions, can stoke instability, and feeds into wider political tensions. And my goodness, the whole of Europe is seeing that today. The Arctic is becoming a new flashpoint due to the climate crisis directly. You've heard how sea ice is receding and at 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. But let's put that into a geopolitical perspective. The Russian Duma has claimed it's a Russian internal sea, whereas we treat the Arctic as international waters. So there's risk of conflict over access, over resources, and of course over shipping routes. So the climate crisis is now shaping strategic and military competition. And although we're talking more about climate security as in general, we're not yet acting as if peace and addressing the climate are 2 sides of the same coin. And then there's the potential for instability at home. For example, food price shocks and supply chain disruption, which Paul went through so eloquently, with just this week food inflation still at 4.9%. So whilst our inflation has come down in this country, food inflation hasn't. And Paul's covered this, but I would just add one interesting 120-year-old quote. There are only 9 meals between mankind and anarchy. We had a tiny flavour of this during COVID, with panic buying of all things toilet rolls and, of course, food. I could only get crevettes, which nobody eats, when I went to the supermarket. We're seeing a growing need for military support in emergencies, floods, fires, heat waves. In 2019 in Derbyshire, the Royal Air Force had to send Chinooks to drop concrete and prevent a dam collapse after torrential rain. It wasn't that long after that the 2 dams collapsed in Libya. That is a glimpse of our future if we don't both cut emissions and adapt our infrastructure to what is coming down the road to us. Finally, personal economic impacts, and this has been made completely clear by Hugh and others. Uninsurable homes. There are parts of the world that are uninsured now, and parts of this country which are getting that way, and the loss of livelihoods when you've been flooded out again and again and again. And I'll give just one example. Hugh mentioned his son. My son was flooded out of Shepherd's Bush, of all places. He suffered £60,000 worth of damage to his flat and couldn't live in it for 6 months. One flood, one flat, and there were 21 flats on that street that were flooded out. What is the cost to the insurance companies? I'm amazed he's still insured. But what concerns me most is not any single crisis. It's crises cascading together, multiple crises: food, health, infrastructure, migration, energy, extreme weather, etc., all hitting at the same time, eroding trust in government by slow or failed responses and reactionary politics claiming to be able to solve all these crises at once. Government systems and institutions risk being overwhelmed, not just strained. The biggest concern is that we're facing the potential of an ungovernable state unless government takes this seriously. Not simply one party losing power and another taking over, but the very real possibility that Western democratic systems themselves cannot cope. And unless we act, we will see a growing breakdown of the norms of society, the very essence of national security, perhaps highlighted by populist non-democratic regimes using authoritarian measures to solve perceived issues. The encouraging part is that what we need to do on climate also makes Britain safer and more resilient. Take energy independence. Renewables, storage and a decentralised grid reduce our dependence on foreign oil and gas, and they're less vulnerable. Like the biomass boiler at St Andrews that provides the heat for the oldest university in Scotland, provides the heat for all their buildings. Or closed-loop geothermal, a baseload heat, just as nuclear is a baseload power production. Look at Ukraine. Russia has targeted their energy networks relentlessly. They managed to knock out roughly half, but not all. Why? Some of the remaining system is nuclear, of course, but much of it is renewables, which are decentralised and dispersed. Wind turbines can't all be knocked out with a single missile. And on that note, some are using the threat from Russia to say, well, let's not worry about climate change now, or not at all. But that's a false choice. Tackling climate is central to our national resilience today. It's part of our today's security threat, not tomorrow. And there are many other measures that we could use on this slide. Overall, we need to embrace the amazing innovation that's happening in this space, but prepare for what's already locked in. In the military, you learn a clear principle. Face the threat that is in front of you, not the threat as you would wish it to be. We have to plan realistically for a future others cannot see or would rather not wish to imagine. A future which would have untold consequences if it came to pass. And just because you don't like the risk does not mean it will go away or can be ignored. Britain has faced severe challenges before, and we prevailed. We prevailed because we had leaders, political leaders, civil leaders and military leaders with the courage to look the threat in the eye and act against a possible outcome they could not predict or guarantee. It takes courage to stand out from your peers and their consensus. And it takes courage to act, particularly in the face of adversity. But there is also good opportunity. If we do treat this as the security challenge it is, the solutions make us stronger. We end up with more secure energy, more resilient infrastructure, and a safer, more stable society. And important to me, and I hope to you, a stronger democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So we need to look this threat in the eye, and we've also heard that if there's a threat looming, if there's a crisis looming, it's a very, very good idea to act quickly, as we've also recently heard from the COVID inquiry. So, okay, there's more to go, but we have to interact with this material, so it's not just about listening to it. So now is another good time to just for a moment just reflect on how is what you have just heard landing with you. And we're going to, and it will be, I'm going to call you back in just a few seconds, a chance just to, if you want to, just to turn to someone next to you and just unload something about how this has hit you. Okay. Okay. Time is really pressing us, so I know that there's so much more we could discuss. There's so much more to talk about. But we need to move on. So let me now introduce to you, we need to hear about some of the implications of this. So to hear about the economic implications, let me introduce to you, please, Angela Francis. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. In every transition, every industrial and agricultural revolution, new technologies replace the old, societies change, you get innovation and productivity leaps, and there are winners and losers, and the losers lobby the government. But change happens. Transitions are uncomfortable. They can make the status quo seem attractive when it's actually a very dangerous place to be, as we've heard. People who are worried about the cost of living and their future need real solutions, and they will come from going forwards, not backwards. They will come from greening our economy faster, even when others are slowing down and sowing division. And there are two big things that are slowing us down. The market rules are not driving the right outcomes, and the old world is not making way for the new. Let's start with the market rules. Net zero and nature-positive solutions will not win in markets which take for granted a stable climate, clean air, fresh water, pollinators. We currently produce and consume in a way that doesn't factor in our impact on the planet. And that is an economy-wide problem, and we fix it by setting new rules of the game. We have done some of that already. We have not done enough, and we are actually in danger of rolling back. We need to consistently reward the businesses that are doing the work to be competitive in a new world where success includes lowering carbon, restoring soils, keeping forests standing, circular use of resources and less waste, all things that add to our resilience. We know that there's a positive link between environmental reporting and a company's returns, but the companies who disclose their carbon are already the ones who are doing relatively well, and even they experience a dip in financial performance, a hump, before they see positive effects in the long term. And that disjoint, that hump, is getting in the way of the transition. Plus, those companies are doing all this extra work to lower their environmental footprint, restore what we've lost. They have to invest, they have to pay extra, they have to pay for certification, and then they either have to beat the competition on price, or they have to find the 5 or 10% of the market that will pay a premium. All while those who are doing nothing, who are profiting from putting us at risk, get the same financial terms, get the same market access, get the same profit. That tells you that our rules aren't working. And it's government's job to change the rules when there are obvious market failures like this. The second thing that's slowing us down, the old guard are fighting not to be replaced. There are businesses that lose in any transition, but some could avoid it. Fossil fuel companies and big agricultural companies, they could diversify and they could clean up their act. Ørsted was a fossil fuel company that decided to become a renewables business, and that was in 2009. And 10 years later, it was the largest offshore wind producer in the world, consistently outperforming the FTSE 100 and outperforming fossil fuel companies that hadn't made that switch like Shell. But the picture for the next Ørsted doesn't look so good. Spikes in the oil and gas prices since Russia invaded Ukraine have made fossil fuels very profitable again. And unless you have an automatic windfall tax, you can see why staying in that old world might be a very good strategy. And unfortunately, too many companies are making that choice, and they have deep pockets, and they can buy lobbyists, they can buy media space, they can even buy politicians to sow doubt and sow distrust. We have seen this before. We saw it with the tobacco industry lobbying against the science, and it is happening here too. It is always government's job to distinguish between the overall economic interest and the interests of those it is hearing from most. But changes in industry take a long time to reflect in the voices that government hears. That will fix itself eventually, but it's the feature of these transitions that the companies that will be the industries of tomorrow, they get frustrated and outvoted. They often end up leaving the trade bodies that are supposed to represent them as the old guard dig in and protect their interests. So independent voices, academics, civil society are really important right now. And another thing that's important to say is that people and places should not be the winners and losers in this transition. Support for places and a safety net and retraining for people is absolutely essential. We need to build confidence in this shared mission if we want a dynamic culture where ideas can come and go, but people can find better jobs in more successful, more productive firms, and places can find their new niche. So, I've said that the economics can tell us when we should be acting, and it tells us how to navigate this transition, but there's also bad economic arguments getting in the way, so let's deal with those too. First, I'll say why we should transition, but this has been said before. Nick Stern said it in 2006, he said it again in his new book. The costs of action massively, the costs of inaction are massively outweighed by the cost of action. I think I said that the wrong way around. The case is overwhelming. Even the most cautious estimates of cost and benefits. Proving that was so important because our economic models were not flashing red in the face of the climate and nature crisis. Models are simplifications, they help us answer particular questions, but they don't include everything that our economy depends on, and they did not include the environment. They didn't include a functioning finance system, if you remember that. Those things are just assumed to be there. So changes or failures are a major blind spot. Now, the OBR, the Bank of England, the Green Finance Institute, they're all correcting that now. They're all aware that climate and nature is a major systemic risk for the economic and finance system. So why are we still not acting? Why is it so hard? Let's deal with the bad arguments. First one, we can't afford net zero. Yes, debt levels are high because of the financial crisis and because of COVID. And that's true that for lots of things that we need in this transition have got upfront costs and long-term benefits. But the economics doesn't change because of the fiscal situation we're in. The investment the UK needs to make to stay on the CCC's balanced pathway is equivalent to about £4 billion a year. That's 0.2% of GDP. And we can start seeing that to pay back from 2041. Even if other countries don't act, that would generate returns for the UK. The majority of that investment would be paid by the private sector. With the right incentives and policy, they would cover 40 to 90% of what is needed. And the public sector share could be funded by national banks and asset-backed lending, where the economics stack up like they do here. Plus, delaying until you can afford it assumes that costs won't increase or that it'll be cheaper later. And that isn't true. Learning by doing delivers major savings. The Oxford Martin School and the Smith School have been looking at this in the context of the energy transition. They compared a fast, a slow, and no transition, and faster is cheaper. The faster transition saves $12 trillion compared to staying on fossil fuels. That is more than twice the saving of a slow transition. Bad argument two, the UK can't do this by itself. The UK can't do this by itself. It's true, the UK can't solve the whole climate and nature crisis by itself, but that's not what is happening. Others are acting. In the last 10 years, we have seen a 7-fold increase in national climate policy around the world. Plus, the best way to get others to act is to act yourself. Leaders drive innovation and make it easier for others to follow. Just let's look at the last 10 years. Globally, wind is being built out 3 times the pace we thought it would be in 2015. Solar installations are 15 times faster than we thought they would be. EVs were expected to have 20% of the market in 2030, have hit that last year, and they're now expected to double market share by 2030. And because faster is cheaper, the cost of the whole UK transition is now 73% cheaper than we thought it would be just 5 years ago. So I'm not going to promise to you the UK will have a leading role in every single part of the green transition. But we will increase our chance of being a designer, a high-value component producer, a project developer if we're involved at the start and if we're working with other countries bilaterally and plurilaterally so we can create the scale necessary for those positive tipping points that Tim talked about in key areas like energy, transport and agriculture. Last bad argument. We can't do this without raising the cost of living, which is code for we can't do this in ways that ordinary households will vote for at the ballot box. The issue of upfront costs and long-term benefits for households is a really good problem to crack, and we will not crack it by sitting on our hands. Inflation would have been 7% lower if we had decarbonised the power sector ahead of Russia invading Ukraine. It would have been a further 9% lower if our food system wasn't linked to fossil fuels through fertiliser prices, which went up 400% at that same time. And it would have been 11% lower if we'd have switched to heat pumps earlier. Think of all the good people we could have helped if we had acted earlier. And we can't go back, but we can avoid making the same mistake twice by acting now. And those customers are a major asset in this transition. Businesses want to develop their products and their business models where there are people, ideally informed and enthusiastic supporters of action like we have in the UK, so they can test their offer in the real world and build to scale. Trusted companies that can insulate our homes, install energy efficient appliances, home renewables with a guarantee to save consumers money, they've got a rock solid investment. Ideas that enable people who don't have cash up front to start saving on their bills are the ones that the government and the finance sector could back. So, how do we navigate this transition well? We need to do all the obvious things. We need patient, outcome-focused strategy, because it gives room for innovation and surprising answers that you don't get if you only work within sector boundaries or you only focus on your pet projects. We need to align incentives, so standards, taxes, subsidies, procurement, all back the businesses that are investing and innovating to reduce risk. We need to think internationally. Most of the sectors we now need to transition, industrial goods, agricultural goods, are globally traded. So we need carbon border adjustments and we need minimum standards so that our efforts in the UK are effective, and we're building the secure supply chains with partners overseas who are solving the same problems that we are. We need to use government money and regulation sparingly and smartly. Evidence supports subsidies that are time limited, taxes that ratchet up over time and can be avoided. I don't mean avoided in a Cayman Islands way. I mean avoid them by doing the right actions. And when those clean alternatives have been developed, we need the old technologies to be just phased out. We need to highlight risks but not eliminate them. Risk moves people. So government should speed up the process of businesses seeing what risks they face, but it should get ready for some failures. And I want to end with what might be an unusual test of our transition, but it has to work for low and middle income households. They are key to public acceptance and they are key to building really leading businesses. There's going to be a lot of jobs. There will be a lot of jobs created in this transition, but governments being overly jobs focused can increase the risk of expensive mistakes. And these are filtered out if our test is, how does this action help consumers? How efficiently are we improving people's lives? The jobs that are built on that strategy will be around for a long time, and I would argue, so is the government that makes that their focus. So some people are making bad choices in this transition, but the economics is clear. We should choose the rules that make businesses stronger and more resilient, the investments that will pay us back for decades, and a future where households are better off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. So we've heard we need economic change. We've heard bad arguments have been holding us back. We can do it. It's cheaper. It provides secure jobs, and the UK can make a difference. So now on to our last briefing before we go on to look at what we can do in this room and the ask of everyone in this room. So finally, to look at the energy transition now, over to you, Tessa Khan. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a privilege to be a part of this important briefing. I want to build on what Angela's already said by focusing on a central preoccupation for most people across the UK at the moment, and that is the price of energy. In the last few years, our skyrocketing energy bills have been a major factor driving inflation and the cost of living pressure felt by so many people and businesses. It is turning into a significant political risk for the energy transition. Unless we ensure that renewable energy and electrification, which are the best route away from fossil fuels, are more affordable for people than the status quo, It's a genuine threat, I would say, to the public mandate for decarbonisation. Thankfully, the evidence is clear that an energy system powered by renewables will indeed be more affordable and more economically secure. And I want to say a bit more about why that's true on multiple levels and on the political choices that are open to us to ensure that this is the case in both the short and long term. First of all, zooming out, our dependency on fossil fuels has been responsible for huge economic shocks in the last 50 years. In fact, around half of the UK's recessions since 1970 have been caused by fossil fuel price shocks. Most recently, while it didn't cause a recession, the spike in wholesale gas prices and to a lesser extent oil caused by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine resulted in the government spending £64 billion to help households and businesses who would otherwise be overwhelmed. That is more than the UK's annual defence budget. In addition to that, the extra cost of gas, electricity and fuel for households was another £60 billion. What that translates into, in very human terms, are the people who are forced to take shelter in the winter in the designated community warm spaces that they can access because they can't afford to turn on their heating. According to the End Fuel Poverty Coalition, there are now more than 12 million households across the UK who are struggling to pay their energy bills. That is where our current energy mix has gotten us. Even today, gas prices remain double the levels that they were before this crisis began. And given our exceptional dependency on gas, including the fact that it's how we heat more than 80% of our homes across the UK, this has led to an intolerable financial crisis for countless people. The question then is whether or not shifting away from fossil fuels towards increased electrification and renewable energy will change that picture. And again, I want to start here by zooming out. An energy system based on renewables offers countless obvious economic advantages over one that runs on fossil fuels. Most obviously, the input, sun or wind, is free forever. Whereas if you buy a barrel of oil, as soon as you burn that, you need to buy another one. And the price that you pay for it is determined by a cartel of petrostates or subject to the whim of dictators. Further, the price of key technologies for a renewables-based power system has steeply declined in recent years, with the cost of electricity from offshore wind dropping more than 50% in the last decade, more than 70% in the case of solar, and the price of battery storage dropping more than 80% in that same period. Just as importantly, renewables are also vastly more efficient than fossil fuels. A typical petrol car only uses about 25% of the energy in its fuel to actually move its wheels. Most is lost as heat, and the fossil fuel system as a whole wastes about 2/3 of the raw energy that goes into it. So unsurprisingly, it's better not to dig up and burn million-year-old fossilised remains of plants and animals when renewable energy, which doesn't involve combustion and therefore constant heat loss, is so much more efficient. The reality, though, as we know, as Angela has also touched on, is that we're now at that point in the transition when we need a whole lot of upfront investment to shift our infrastructure to support clean electricity, whether that's upgrading our grid or switching to heat pumps. But these are the equivalent of growing pains, not a sign that we should stop what is absolutely the right direction of travel, especially when, as we've heard repeatedly this morning, delaying this transition only risks adding to its costs. More importantly, the scale of those costs and who bears them are ultimately political choices. For example, other countries have found ways to lower the cost of capital for some of the big investments that we'll need to make, whether that's through the use of central bank tools or their equivalent of our newly established National Wealth Fund. As for our household and industrial energy bills, as we saw in yesterday's budget, there are ways of structuring our bills so that they reflect the true cost of the lower costs of renewable power. Not that I would necessarily endorse exactly how it was done yesterday. But my point is that there are no shortage of innovative, credible ideas for doing this in the short term, including breaking the link between gas and electricity prices by taking gas-powered stations into public control. Not least of all, we've known for a long time that one of the fastest ways to bring down bills is by insulating our homes so that they don't leak energy out of our roofs and windows, and yet we still have some of the draftiest, coldest housing stock in Europe. The other huge economic upside to this transition is the potential to create good jobs in the parts of the country that desperately need it most. For example, it's an incontrovertible geological and economic reality that jobs in the North Sea oil and gas industry are now, and have been for a while, in decline. Even with hundreds of oil and gas licences issued in the last decade, the jobs supported by that sector have halved. What we now need is a proper plan to ensure that clean energy jobs offer decent conditions and that they're in the places that they are needed the most. But the good news is, whether you're talking about Hull or Aberdeen, many of these places are already connected to our best renewable resources, including the massive amount of offshore wind we have in the North Sea. And yet it took until this year, a quarter of a century after we switched on our first offshore wind farm in Northumberland, for the government to publish a comprehensive plan for creating almost 1 million clean energy jobs. Now, for those jobs to actually materialise, we need that plan to be backed by investment and to support workers and to supply chains to pivot to these new industries. Again, none of this is impossible, and the rewards on the other side are enormous. I understand that it may feel at this point like getting to an electrified energy system anchored in renewable energy requires too much planning, too much infrastructure, too much investment. And so I want to end by reminding you that after the discovery of North Sea gas in the 1960s, the British state executed a massive conversion of our energy infrastructure to accommodate natural gas over gas coming from coal. Over about a decade, we retrofitted or replaced more than 30 million appliances, constructed a vast new transmission network, and rebuilt regional gas distribution. When the opportunity for a vastly superior energy system arose, we grasped it. Of course, although it was done in a way at the time that was fair for consumers, we all know that the shift away from coal was devastating for miners and for their communities. This time around, we not only have the opportunity for a better energy system, one that is safer, cleaner, cheaper and more reliable, but we also know how to get to that ambitious goal in a way that is genuinely just for ordinary people. There is no bigger prize than that, so we can and must seize that opportunity again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tessa. So we can have this change, so what's stopping us? We've heard a lot today. I want to see how it's landed with everybody here. So I'm going to do a few straw polls. So first of all, if you think that in broad terms, the information you've heard today, the situation is about as serious as the situation you've heard today, can you put up your hand, please? Keep them up in the air, have a good look around. There's a lot of hands in the air. Okay, if you think that in broad terms the seriousness of the situation has been fundamentally exaggerated today, be brave. Can you put up your hand, please? Come on, be brave. As always, we respect independence of mind. There's not a single hand in the air. If you think that the situation is even more serious than what we've heard today, can you put up your hand, please? Okay, have a good look around. Actually, it feels like almost half the hands are in the air, and mine could be there too. Okay. And you might think that you're not a representative group, but I've done exactly that test with over 100 different groups now. Some of them are very sustainably minded, but some of them are just business audiences with no kind of particular view to sustainability at all. And you know what? It's the same result every single time. We all get it. But somehow we're just waiting, or we have until now been waiting for everybody else to take the kind of action we need as a society. So this situation can feel overwhelming, and I get that too, but we in this room have faced it so that together we can start to deal with it. You might even have experienced a good dose of relief that things aren't in fact so bad that we can't look them in the eye. But misinformation has plagued our response. We've heard that misinformation has thwarted the climate and nature COPs, and that bad arguments have been holding us back into economics as usual, and so on. And there have been narratives like, colder and poorer, when in fact it's richer and warmer. So, what are we asking for today? So, firstly, we want a reset of the national conversation. Today is about establishing the evidence and the stakes. We are asking for a World War II level of leadership. So, leadership as if the survival of our society depends on it, because it does. And that includes emergency legislation, investment, and job creation. And none of that is possible without a campaign of public information and engagement. And we're calling on your help in this public information and engagement campaign. So one specific ask on this right now is that we have a letter that we ask you to sign to Keir Starmer, to all the public service providers, all the public service broadcasters, and to Ofcom. And I'm very pleased to be able to invite someone onto the stage to actually read the text of this. So please welcome Olivia Williams. Thank you.
Hello, I'm the twirly of the group. I don't have a PhD, but we are so privileged to have heard these extraordinary people speak. We are the lucky ones. We've got to hear it right here, right now. And all your constituents deserve to hear it too, right? So this is how you're going to make sure that everybody in this country gets to hear these people say these things. To Sir Keir Starmer, to Tim Davie at the BBC, to Carolyn McCall at ITV, to Jonathan Allen at Channel 4, to Sarah Rose at Channel 5, to Geraint Evans at S4C, and Dame Melanie Dawes at Ofcom. Today, hundreds of MPs, peers, and leaders from business, faith, sport, and culture gathered in Westminster for a national emergency briefing. We were presented with the latest evidence showing that the United Kingdom must urgently prepare for a cascade of serious societal impacts. The rapidly escalating climate and nature crises are set to make the UK increasingly unrecognisable and dangerous, with extreme weather events, the risk of food shortages, price shocks, economic instability, and rising geopolitical threat. We are deeply alarmed by the scale of fossil fuel-funded disinformation that has flooded Westminster and the media. The lack of public access to accurate, science-based information has created a vacuum which has been filled by polarised headlines designed to deny and delay action. Under the Communications Act of 2003, all public service broadcasters must inform the public on major national and international issues. That is the law. The UK broadcasters have so far failed to meet these obligations, despite the Climate Change Committee urging the government to provide trusted public information. We therefore ask the government and all public service broadcasters to hold an urgent televised national emergency briefing. We asked them to run a comprehensive public engagement campaign so that everyone understands the profound risks this crisis poses to themselves and to their family. If delivered urgently and truthfully, with ambition matching the scale of the crisis, this will not only ensure that the public is properly informed, but will also offer the protection that knowledge and preparedness bring. Not just the protection, but the opportunities that preparedness brings. Such a campaign will resonate with the public, opening up the political space for action, not debate. We are not safe. This is an emergency. Now is the time for courage and to put trust in the public. The UK has a track record of uniting to face difficult challenges. Now is the time to do this again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And in a few minutes, we'll actually put the QR code up on the screen, which you'll be able to use to sign that letter right now. Meanwhile, we're also going to be producing a film of today's event, presented by Chris Packham, and to be shown up and down the UK. And we're asking for your help in promoting that. But more widely, all of you have power and influence. And we ask you to think about what your own power is and use it. In the UK, we have a track record of facing difficult situations and rising to the challenge, of coming together and leading the world out of trouble. And we need to do that now. Between us all, we can give the UK the credibility to help lead the global response along with other proactive countries. I said at the start that this situation is not hopeless, but hope is a discipline. It needs human endeavour to make it a reality. So we are asking you now to have courage in this critical moment. To enable this, we ask you to reflect on the forces that push you to deny, ignore, or trivialize the challenge. The forces that come from within and those that come at you from outside. And we ask you to find what it takes to be brave and to stand up for the change, especially when it is uncomfortable. Because this can feel overwhelming, we're asking you to find the strength and face it, and to see that the excitement of doing the right thing can actually outweigh that fear of change. Please take courage from within you, but also from the knowledge that you are not alone. The show of hands that we've just seen in this room gives you permission, responsibility, and support to act in a way that is truly commensurate with this challenge. And remember, the show of hands in this room is not unique. It's up and down the country. We know we need to change. In this room today, we've collectively faced it, and that gives us a chance to change it. And now, I know we've run over, but there was a lot to get through, and it was all very important. So now we have a short time for some questions. And so if all the speakers can come up. And I think, first of all, maybe we'll read the first question while the chairs are being arranged. So, first of all, we have Martin Stew from ITV News. Martin, are you Are you here? Okay, just 1 second while people take their seats.
Sure.
Okay. Martin, your question.
You describe this as a national emergency briefing and a need for World War II style leadership. I wonder, when we look at polling at the moment, we see that more people are accepting that climate change is real and is a problem, but fewer people are taking action, and partly there is a perception that's because there is scaremongering, it feels too big and people turn away from that. How do you persuade politicians and the public who believe that UK's emissions are a small part of this, we can't make a difference, that we can?
Okay, so who feels like taking that one on? Hugh, go.
I'll make a start. We know from behaviour, it's a good question, by the way, thank you. We know from a lot of behaviour change that the thing that mostly changes our behaviour is the changes of the behaviour that are around us. So any one of us has enormous agency.